towards our presentation now. And I invite everybody to, if you haven't done so already, please turn off your microphones. And today we are fortunate enough to have Mr. David Fell of Utilities Kingston with us. And David will be sharing insights on what the role of local distribution companies are within the broader context of Ontario's recently unveiled energy transition strategy. That's the strategy that seeks to create new generation capacity while shifting us away from fossil fuel-derived energies. David is the President and Chief Executive Officer and a member of the Board of Directors of Utilities Kingston and Kingston Hydro, and has been with them since joining in January of 2022. He has his Master's of Business Administration degree from Queen's University, as well as an Honours Bachelor of Arts degree in Philosophy from McMaster. And previous to Utilities Kingston, David was the CEO of Eastern Ontario Regional Broadband Network, EORN, which has invested over $400 million into Eastern Ontario to extend high-speed fixed and mobile broadband access for rural residents. EORN is a nonprofit corporation that also owns a for-profit company called EORN Consulting Services, and David has also spent 7 years as vice president, founder, and co-owner of an e-learning software company called Operatel. Operatel was recognized in 2008 by Profit Magazine as one of Canada's top 100 fastest growing profitable companies. So, David, we have a fantastic group of people here that are really in the wheelhouse of energy in Ontario. So I think they'll be all ears, and everyone please silently welcome David.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Paul. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces and folks that I've worked with both on EORN and at the city. We're usually in different kind of meetings than this. So I'm going to share my screen and flip over to the presentation. And just let me.
And David, would you prefer questions as we go along or wait till the end?
Happy to take questions as we go. If I can, as I'm remembering with Zoom, I can only see 2 or 3 faces in the little side box. So if someone can give me, I can see Darko and Tom. Actually, I can see Paul. I can see your screen as well. So if someone either wants to give me a thumbs up or else just put something in the chat, that would be great as well. Okay. And Darko, everyone can see that? That's good. Great. So as we start this morning, I just want to recognize that the energy transition is much bigger than electricity and power. It's definitely going to impact our gas, water, and wastewater utilities. But as I started to pull together the presentation, I realized if I tried to speak to all 4 of our utilities, it would be much longer than 20 minutes. So I'm just going to focus on Kingston Hydro and the power sector. And a couple other things I wanted to say just as we get started is, you know, this is an incredibly complex challenge that we have. And I think the CEO of the IESO, Leslie Gallinger, who's responsible for the energy market in Ontario, she was recently quoted in, I think it was the Globe and Mail, and she said, in many ways, the energy transition is like solving a Rubik's Cube. It's complex, multi-dimensional puzzle, and we need to align on all sides. So I think when the CEO of the IESO talks about the complexity, that's a real message for all of us. In order for us to wrap our head around what's coming down the pipe and how fast things are changing, we actually commissioned a national advisory firm called Power Advisory. And they're doing a series of reports for us that we're sharing with our board of directors, and we will be sharing with city council. Council's being asked to vote on a number of motions, and that were just recently they passed a blanket motion of support for battery storage, and we're hoping to provide a higher level overview of the energy transition as it emerges. So Kingston Hydro has a strategic plan, which is up for renewal at the end of 2024. And when it was written, there was really nothing in there about energy transition. It wasn't on the radar of the organization 5 years ago. But in the Utilities Kingston strategic plan, we do have a theme to demonstrate climate action leadership. And last year, when I started at Utilities Kingston, we did an organizational restructuring, and we created a climate and sustainability group along with a manager and resources for that group. So that's a bit of the strategic background for our organization. And I like to include this particular slide because people often get confused about the ownership and the operations of local distribution companies. So the city of Kingston owns the hydro company and the hydro assets. They own all of the water, wastewater, gas, hot water heater rentals, and streetlights. So the city owns all of the assets. And we have a contract at Utilities Kingston to manage, operate, and maintain them. And the hydro company that we're primarily going to talk about today, we operate in an extremely regulated environment. And I know some of you have talked to me again, as we mentioned, about solar projects and other projects. The regulatory environment is primarily controlled by two organizations, the Ontario Energy Board. They set our rates, and their primary focus is on protecting consumers. They also regulate profit. And then the IESO is responsible for the market for supply and demand. And I start off at this sort of structural level because one of the things that the energy transition is changing is the regulatory environment. And if historically the primary responsibility for managing the market and the wholesale market was with the IESO, someone mentioned decentralization, democratization of energy. The whole regulatory framework needs to change in order to support that so that we can continue to have a supply of safe, reliable, and clean power. So that's our corporate structure. This is a slide from the very first, one of the first pages of our report from Power Advisory. And I think everyone recognizes that the energy transition is really accelerating. That is influenced by federal and provincial governments. And in large part, part of the federal government carbon taxes and clean energy, the CER, is having an influence. But I think I mentioned I've been in Toronto the last 2 days. Yesterday, Nick Nanos is a national polling firm. They don't do any work for any of the political parties, but Nick was talking about politics in Canada. And right now, if there was an election tomorrow, the polls are suggesting that there could be a majority conservative government by a significant majority. And I mention that because, a lot of the changes that are coming down the pipe, the regulatory pieces and the things that are impacting us, when a government changes, this is not a straight line going forward in terms of transition. There are all kinds of different factors that can influence that. And I'm sure some of you have seen the commercials on TV from the Alberta government lobbying against the federal government and carbon tax and people coming home and their power is out. So I think what I wanted to recognize here is that the energy transition is happening, but there are a lot of different factors that are going to influence the speed at which it happens, and it might not be a straight line forward. I could probably have included 10 or 15 slides about the gap between supply and demand, but I think this is a really clear, simple one. And this is from the IESO's Pathways to Decarbonization report and the annual planning outlook, just to give everyone a sense of how big this transition challenge is. We have a rapidly growing population. We have electrification happening. We have aging nuclear reactors. And this is going to shift the province's electricity grid from really decades of surplus to shortages in just a few years. So currently they're suggesting, if you look at the graph there, that by 2026, the province's grid could strain to meet peak demand. And by 2030, you can see that demand could outpace generation. So this is a really significant challenge. And from that Pathways report, there's a lot of information on this slide, but really, I think if you look on the left side at system capacity today and pathways to decarbonization in 2050, you can clearly see that we need double the supply of energy. And you can see the proposed mix of different energy types that the province is looking at on a go-forward basis. And of course, there are other pieces that make it more complex. I have a couple more slides from RBC to look at the cost of this transition that's projected. The IESO's own costs are around $400 billion. RBC, I think in the next slide, $450 billion. And this is a mix of investments in the grid, investments in new generation sources. And one of the things that RBC talked about in their report that came out this summer is ways that this can be mitigated. And a lot of the focus that you're going to hear in the media and even the things that I'm focusing on today are about new sources of supply and changes to the grid. But energy conservation, which has not really been emphasized as much, I would say, in most of the media reports, it could have a significant impact on lowering the costs and assisting with the transition. So if you look at the bottom of that slide, they're talking about new technologies, energy conservation, enough power to power 3 million homes by the early 2040s, a little more than half of the province's residential electricity demand. And there's an example of some of the kinds of energy conservation technologies that are already available. So this is not, net new technology, and the possibility of saving perhaps up to $500 million in avoided generation costs. So many of you would have also likely seen the Government Ontario's Powering Ontario's Growth document. There really wasn't much new in that report. It's kind of a reiteration of existing and prior policy announcements, but the big headline, if you will, pieces in that announcement is new nuclear development, 3 new 300 megawatt small modular reactors, incremental to the previous one that they had announced. And just to give you a sense of the size of a 300 megawatt reactor, it sounds like a lot. It sounds like it's going to make a big difference, but the gas peaker plant just south of Napanee, that actually can produce about just under 2,000 megawatts of power. So 3 of these nuclear reactor, small modular nukes, would not replace that one power plant that's just south of Napanee. And now that is a peaker plant. It doesn't run 24/7, but it gives you a sense of how much of these small modular nukes are required to replace existing energy. They're also talking about construction of new reactors at Bruce, so 4,800 megawatts of new supply, and the possibility of refurbishing Pickering B reactors. And that would be 2,000 megawatts of continued supply. So from the province's point of view, and from the banks and the markets, this is going to be costly. If we look at just on the energy conservation side, what is the vision for net zero homes, and how will this impact on the grid? And take a look at all the different types of appliances. One of the really interesting things when you look at this diagram, and again, if you reflect back to what I was saying about Kingston Hydro in UK We also run a gas utility. And one of the things you'll see in this vision of a net zero home is that there's no gas hot water heating. There are no gas appliances, no stoves or fireplaces, and there's no gas heating. So as an energy distributor, this is another thing that I'm not going to talk too much about it today, but we definitely need to figure out what to do with the sort of somewhere between 50 and $100 million of infrastructure we have in gas pipes in the ground and the resources that we have there. So this is kind of a vision of the future and a lot of what is expected to drive at a consumer level the energy transition. So to get more into what we are doing, just to give you again some of the context, we do have, as I mentioned, 4 utilities, but the geographic area for our utilities is not, it doesn't overlap consistently in all cases. So this is our distribution territory. So over on the left or the west side of the city, that's all Hydro One, and on the east side as well. And Enbridge Gas is also on the outside, and our primary gas territory is in the heart of the city. We do have one small, what we call embedded area, which is out around CFP Kingston and the base. That's where you see MS5. So that is a historical part of our territory. And that gives you a little bit of a sense of, often when the city of Kingston is talking about energy transition or growth or electrification, we can certainly do things to influence what's happening in our territory. But you can see that a lot of the city of Kingston is outside our territory. And that does have some pretty significant implications for energy transition. One of the biggest things that we're going to need to do in the whole region, and this is both Kingston Hydro and Hydro One, is ensure that we have sufficient transmission and distribution capacity to support increased electrification. And this is where some of that, $400 billion in new capacity in the grid is going to be required. So in the fall of 2021, you can look this up online. You get a good sense of the details in the report. But the IESO did a regional planning exercise. So they went from Peterborough to Kingston, and they looked at future supply and demand and the gap between supply and demand. And one of the really interesting things about their integrated regional resource plan, for the first time ever, they did a scenario-based model. So what happens if, growth continues to happen at the current pace that it has been for the last 10 years? And just to give you a sense of that, our historical residential customer growth over the last 10 years is only about 0.22%. What happens if we start to see significant electrification happening in the medium term and then much more rapidly? And I want to acknowledge the city of Kingston was very, very helpful in providing feedback to the IESO on expectations for growth in electrification in the region, talking about electrification of fleet and transit. So one of the significant implications of this report is that there are 2 transmission stations in the city of Kingston, one called the Frontenac Station and the other on Gardner's Road. Kingston Hydro draws power from those 2 stations. The one at Frontenac is basically totally at capacity and can't be expanded. The one at Gardner's is being expanded now, but it doesn't have a significant amount of additional capacity. And there needs to be a new transmission station built in the city of Kingston to support electrification. And so the IESO and Kingston Hydro and Hydro One, we've all agreed, and we're starting to do the planning. But that's just to give you a sense of that, just within our city and our region, that's about a $40 to $50 million project that we're planning for now. It takes about 4 to 5 years to get through the regulatory approval process for those, and another 2 to 3 years to build something like that. Transformers used to be sort of 6 to 12 months to order. Now we're talking about 3 years. So those are some of the timelines. And that's really significant, because if there's if there is growth on the east end of the city, Hydro One doesn't have enough power to support increased electrification sort of east of the river. And in the near future, we expect to have some constraints even in the downtown core. So that's one of the big projects that we're working on, is building a brand new transmission station so that we can get enough power into the city of Kingston. I mentioned the other day that council voted to support a generic resolution of support for any battery storage projects. And the role of storage is very, very new into the grid and the whole energy transition. And even philosophically, I think people are debating and discussing what that role is going to be. You know, historically, the grid was really just generation, which could be hydro, solar, wind, nuclear, gas, transmission, and then distribution at our level. So storage is essentially a whole new component of the grid, and it can be both a supply and demand, which is really unique because you're going to use power at low overnight rates when we have a surplus, and then you're going to discharge it and provide supply during the day. So it can be capacity backup. It can offer resilience for the grid. And everything that you're hearing in the paper now about the IESO auctions and the approvals for battery projects, none of those exist in Canada yet. And the IESO and the OEB are going to need to figure out how to do a better job of integrating those into the grid. I see Vicky has her hand up.
I do. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. This is excellent and super informative. I'm just wondering if Utilities Kingston is thinking about including storage, as that first chart you showed of all the different levels of activity. It's my belief that battery storage should be a public utility, because I don't really see the raison d'etre of letting private enterprise make money on storing and then supplying at a higher cost. So could you talk a little bit about Utilities Kingston's own interest in storage, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. And I think on the next slide, I'll save part of the answer to the next slide, but we had been working with a Canadian energy storage company, a national company, and looking at a couple of storage projects. We did put proposals into the IESO auction, and the sites that we were looking at were near the Point Pleasant water treatment plant. One of the challenges with storage in the city of Kingston is that it does require a significant amount of land, and the city is also very, very constrained to support growth, both in residential housing and employment land. So finding a site that works and that is in the right area to connect to the grid and supply that can be challenging. In the current round of the IESO auction, we likely won't go forward with a proposal. We're still doing the business case and looking at some of the technical pieces, but I think we're definitely open to it. And Vicky, that was a great transition, I guess, to my next slide. This lot of information to share on this slide, but one of the projects you might have heard us presenting to City Council is a partnership with a company called HydroStore. It's a Canadian company. They have a patented technology that they use, advanced compressed air storage, and they've purchased land south of Napanee near the gas peaker plant, and they have a proposal into the IESO to build an advanced compressed air storage facility that would be able to store 500 megawatts of power for 8 to 12 hours, which is really significant and much more than most battery storage projects can only store for 4 to 6 hours. I see, yes, you asked about the Novelis property. We actually have also talked to Invista about potentially using some of their property. The Collins Bay Penn site, in talking to the city, it's been very challenging to I guess, for the city to have discussions with the federal government about unlocking access to that property. And I know that I don't know any of the details, but I know the city is always talking to the federal government about potential for that. So back to the compressed air storage project. This is right now in the IESO auctions. They're doing auctions for new supply. They're doing auctions for storage, and the provincial government has directed the IESO to review 2 pumped water storage projects, one in Marmora and the other, I think it's Meaford. The problem is there is absolutely no market for long-term, long-duration storage right now. There's no commercial pathway to go forward. So we've been working with HydroStore on that, and essentially I could have done a whole other presentation on that. They did present to council, and it was very well received, and council supported it. But this is using commercial kind of off the shelf. It's not new technology, but it's really using the same technology and the same principles that we use for gas storage, where you drill a large hole, a large shaft in the ground. You create a purpose-made cavern underground. The site is about 100 to 150 acres. They put a small lake on top, and overnight, again, they use power when we have a surplus of power, when we pay the United States to take that surplus power. They use that power to compress air underground in a cavern. They take the heat out and store the heat in a katabatic process. And then during the day, when we need that power, they pour water down the shaft, which forces the air to come up and drive turbines. They mix it with the heat, and they can store up to 500 megawatts. We think it's a very interesting new technology that could really support Eastern Ontario. And so we're working with HydroStore and the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte to push that project forward. Battery storage and the compressed air storage and other things. These are just a couple examples of what is now being called in the market distributed energy resources. So again, if historically the grid was mostly focused on poles and wires, now we're looking at all kinds of new sources of supply. And over on the left, you'll see this is really what our historical responsibility was, prudent asset ownership and renewing our asset poles and wires and substations, implementing programs, making sure that the network is reliable. The middle area we see as not really optional. This is where the market is going. So distributed energy resources are typically what are called non-wires alternatives. So instead of investing capital in poles and wires, we're now enabling the discharge of distributed energy resources within our local distribution territory. So that's very, very different than getting power from that wholesale market through the IESO and bringing it into our territory through those 2 transmission stations. The IESO has identified 4,500 potential DERs in Ontario, worth approximately $500 million a year. And the really interesting thing about DERs, I'm doing a lot of research on this and working with other hydro companies and other hydro CEOs to figure out how this is going to evolve. But it's not just storage. DERs can be new supply, so it can be solar and wind. It could be storage that's discharged, and it can be demand response. So the IESO sees organizations like Walmart or Costco down in southwestern Ontario, all the greenhouses that are emerging. For example, Cogen at Queens, these can all be demand response. Like if we are hitting a peak in our power in our distribution territory, and there might be a gap between supply and demand in the wholesale market, we can actually, in the future, the vision is that we might be paying companies to actually turn off or turn down their power consumption so that we don't hit those peaks. And those are all non-wires alternatives. One of the really challenging things that is currently being worked out. I'm actually in online meetings about this afternoon, is how are we going to create a market for these non-wires alternatives and these DERs? How are we going to take some of the money that we would historically have used for capital to build new infrastructure, and how are we going to use that to enable and connect DERs into the grid? How are we going to discharge them? And so one of the, I guess it's not really a theory, the province is working on this, and all kinds of LDCs are working on this together and on their own, is that there'll be a need to create a new secondary market on top of the wholesale market, and they're calling this a DSO, distribution system operator. And there are many different models and theories on how this is going to work. We don't have it in Ontario right now, but in Northern Europe and other jurisdictions around the world, they already operate DSOs. And so there's a whole market development piece that has to happen. And we are exploring that in other partnerships. One of the LDCs, or local distribution companies, we're working with is down in Essex, and they are running a live pilot right now. They are consistently in the summer hitting their peak threshold or potentially overloading their system. And so they've created an online market where they can put a call into a local market for DERs to just discharge or demand response, and people can get paid to do that within the local market instead of selling through the IESO. I see three bigger questions. I have one more slide, so I think I'm just going to finish the last slide, and then I'll come back to the questions, if that's okay. So in terms of, for Utilities Kingston and Kingston Hydro, what are our strategic priorities to support energy transition? At the one end of the spectrum, we do need to, at a minimum, invest $40 to $50 million in the creation of a new distribution station to support electricity load growth. And no amount of DERs in the short term or a DSO is going to allow us to avoid that capital investment. I think that we're all pretty clear on that. We are looking at strategic opportunities to increase the scale of the organization and our customer base, especially through residential growth, because the city is facing significant challenges in terms of new housing starts. We're working with Hydrostore on the advanced compressed air storage project. That project could take, somewhere from 5 to 8 years to build, and it's somewhere $1 billion to $2 billion. This would not be a subsidy from the provincial government. All they're looking for is a long-term contract from the IESO to provide that 500 megawatts of supply, much like the pumped water storage projects. And then we're also spending a lot of time and energy researching and working with other LDCs to understand how many potential DERs are in our distribution territory that could come from behind the meter in a new future where the regulations have changed. They're now in front of the meter. They're both drawing supply from the provincial grid at overnight, and they're discharging during the day, and the development of how those markets are going to work. We did a fantastic project with the Queen's MBA class where we had 11 different teams at Queen's take our strategic plan for climate action, and they spent a whole semester developing, treating us as a client and doing consulting projects for us. So that was really interesting. And I guess the other big piece that we need to sort out is the long-term future of our gas utility in terms of capital and operating costs and planning. Historically, we would look at a planning horizon for assets, for new assets of 40 years. And if the energy transition, the province is looking at 2050, now we only have a 20 to 25 year time to amortize and depreciate those assets. So that's really causing us to relook at that. And the one thing that I didn't touch on a lot in the presentation, because I've been focusing more on, our response as a utility, but the other piece is electric vehicles and the expectations from consumers. There is a future scenario where consumers are both connecting to the grid bi-directionally, where they're both buying and selling from the grid with their EVs. And if you think about that at a local level, there could be 10,000 EVs in the city of Kingston, all wanting to buy and sell at different times. And if you think about the larger provincial market, that the IESO, the wholesale market, that they're used to dispatching, giant gas peaker plants of 2,000 megawatts, or nuclear reactors, or wind and solar. So how are they going to enable both the market and the technology, and understand the availability requirements for supply and demand for 10,000, EVs potentially connected in Kingston? And that's something I think that LDCs, or local distribution companies, are going to need to be involved in, and that's where we see the role of a DSO. So that was my last slide. I'm gonna pause, and then I think there's a fair number of questions already, and there we go.
Thank you very much for that, David. That was excellent. There are a number of questions on the chat. You want to just bang them off one by one, or?
Yeah, I gotta go back to the beginning.
Like, some of them you might be able to field, some of them I can tell you probably not.
Okay. I have not heard anything about Lake on the Mountain near Picton. The two pumped water storage projects, again, that have been, the Marmor project has been in the works, even with Eorn. I know through the Wardens Caucus, they've been promoting that for about 10 years. And the Minister of Energy has directed the IESO to consider those projects and evaluate them and come back with a recommendation by the end of this year. There has been no commitment, I guess, from the province to look at long-term, long-duration storage like the compressed air. So from Mary Jane, unfortunately she had to leave, but progress investigating the use of solar on the property of one of the water treatment plants to supply some of the energy. That was really, was Dan going to jump in on that? That was really an initiative from the city, because they actually own the property. We were looking at that location as a potential location for the 10 megawatt battery storage project. I don't think that's going to go ahead, so we will need to reconnect with the city around that particular space.
I can jump in, David. Yeah, that's still one of the sites on our radar, and we are coordinating with your team over at Utilities Kingston to review whatever opportunities might be available. So ongoing work is happening.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, and just like as the alternative, you look at how much could be generated through solar, and then you look at the battery storage piece. 10 megawatts is, we thought, pretty significant. However, we did have some concerns about that particular location, because there are very large underground water storage tanks, and there's also chlorine gas facility there, which so when you talk about battery storage projects, you talk about the potential risk of fire and contamination of water storage. So we did a lot of engineering analysis. We looked at like all over the world, or at facilities, and a lot of different things to consider with this, because it's relatively new technology. Next question from Bill: how much energy and what portion of total demand goes into running our sewer and water? What alternative sources can be considered to meet sewer and water? Great question. So we do have an active energy management program for our water and sewer treatment plants. And we are, I would say, I think we're in phase 2 of the environmental assessment for the creation of a biogas facility. So the idea with the biogas facility and the work that we were doing there was to look at the solid waste from Cat Bay and Ravensview, and look at the possibility of combining that with green bin waste from the city and extracting the methane gas, cleaning it, and then potentially injecting it into our gas distribution system to reduce, to create some renewable natural gas. That's one alternative that's being examined. The other alternative is to actually put biogas facilities on site at our treatment plants. I believe, and I'm not sure if anyone at the city has a more updated information than I do, but I believe there was potentially a pilot project with a private sector company to put a portable facility out at Ravensview and capture and extract the methane gas, and then use that for cogeneration, which we also have on site. Dan, did you want to jump in on that one, Dan?
Yeah, I was just, you did kind of come to the end there, but yep, that's a project we're currently reviewing with the climate action team on your end, and hoping there might be a demonstration to come. So
great. James.
Oh, sorry, just on that, can you, on the first part of the question was just how much energy is involved in running our sewer and water system? Like, is this a big chunk of the total, or a few percent?
I can jump in there, David, if you want. Just really quickly. It's a relatively small slice of the energy pie from a community perspective, and some of that data is included in the annual greenhouse gas emission reports that the city publishes, and those are available on the city's website.
Thank you very much, Paul. I was going to say, I don't have the exact number off the top of my head, but I do know that it has been declining significantly with active energy management over the last 5 to 10 years. And again, with the support of our friends at the city. Next question, does Kingston want us to rapidly more resident commercial net metering improve for land base? The city want us to. Does Kingston want us to rapidly install more residential or commercial? You know, I don't know that we have a strong, and I don't know if the city wants to comment on this, a strong preference one way or the other. What I will say is, if you think about, for a residential customer, one of the biggest changes, I guess, that's going to happen is that if you were to install more solar, right now you can only use that for your own purposes, right? And that is a big part of what's going to change in the future, so that if you do make those investments, you would have the opportunity to supply that back into the grid. What's the available capacity for net metering today? I don't know that I have the answer to that. I think I'd answer it a slightly different way, in that, as I mentioned, the number that I talked about was 4,500 DERs across the province with up to $500 million annually of potential supply. So there is a belief going forward from the province that there is a significant opportunity for distributed energy resourcing, and that's still at the sort of larger level. Getting down to individual residential customers is probably another level beyond that. Are shareholders or big corporate buying up capacity at the expense of regular individuals? I really don't know the answer to that one. I will say, when I talked about a little bit about biogas or renewable natural gas, we had a very interesting, we spent 3 hours with, we have a company that manages the procurement for gas, and the Enbridge is the largest provincial gas distributor right now, and they are rate regulated by the OEB. We are not rate regulated by the OEB, and they have just wrapping up their cost of service application. So there's a lot of interesting proposals coming in from Enbridge about how they see the future of this. the demand for renewable natural gas, I don't know what it is in quantity, but it's probably up here, and the supply is almost negligible. So there is significant demand in the market for renewable natural gas for sure.
David, if I could just comment, hey, you're doing a great job. Like, it's complicated, and I appreciate that very much. My question would be this, and it's not necessarily just to you, David, it's to everybody, the city, whoever. Is the city want us right now as citizens to go like hell and install as much commercial and residential solar as we possibly can on the rooftops, our backyards, as you can see here? And is the city pro us doing as much as we can? And if we do that at the same time, is conserve some energy so we have net energy descent, as you guys did in the face of growth, I think, according to, I think it was Dan's report several months ago. So that's the question. You don't have to answer it. We can just let that question hover out there unless somebody does have an answer. As a citizen, I don't feel that our city is pro solar or pro us doing these kinds of things. And I don't know, I think it would be a good thing, but somebody would have to tell me different.
I guess I'd have to actually, I hate to answer a question with a question, but in what sense do you feel that the city is not supportive of that? Because
I wouldn't say not supportive, but it's not being promoted like we promote, you know, Poker Run or something like that. You know, really, like if you took that Poker Run budget and put it on promoting people doing rooftop solar and asked people to back off their energy a little bit, which would help the city and give us, and having our own solar gives us a little bit of local sovereignty, a little bit more resilience. And we already do it with the water and watering in alternative days. I don't know whether we need rolling blackouts. I'm sure nobody wants to hear about that. I imagine we'll probably have them at the rate we're going, though. I don't mean just us, city, and no disrespect to anybody here at all. But climate's moving hell of a lot faster than we are.
yeah, I'll let my colleagues at the city comment on that. But what I would say is, I think, James, the biggest challenge from our point of view is like it's not that we're pro or con. It's that right now, the only opportunity for an individual citizen is really to provide supply to themselves to reduce their own, and there's a cost to that. And so, like, I think personally, I think it's great. But I think what we're looking at in the future is, if the regulations change and you have an opportunity to put new generation or supply through solar and perhaps some storage, what I'm focused on is, what am I going to need to invest in my grid, in my distribution territory, to enable that to happen when the regulations change? And there's going to have to be not just $40 million in building a new transmission station, but there's going to be millions of dollars in new technology that can allow us to track and monitor supply at what we would call a nodal level, so that you know, we can't just have all of a sudden supply coming into the grid randomly, and we need to be able to predict and manage that, and that's going to take an investment in systems. And so what I can say in terms of support is, we think that that's where the future is going to be, and I'm trying to figure out how the heck the province is going to enable that from a market point of view, from a regulatory point of view, and from a technology point of view. And that's where my focus on strategy is as a utility, is what you're talking about doing at an individual level, putting solar in your backyard and then having an EV and a power wall in your garage, and wanting to be able to sell power back into the grid when you have a surplus, and then draw when you need it. There's going to need to be a lot of investments from our point of view as a distributor in technology to predict and enable that. And that's where I'm really focused on, because you know, we can promote it all we want, but if we're not ready from a technology point of view to enable all of this micro generation and supply to come into the grid, then it's not going to be helpful. And we're trying to influence and understand as much as we can the development of this new market, because it's a whole new It's a creation of a whole new energy market that doesn't exist right now.
Chad,
David-
do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I have a question to follow up on that. So we've had microfit installations for several years now. Those do exactly that, is that they feed energy into the grid when there's surplus, and then so they're how is the technology for net metering different than what was used for the microfits?
So I think Alexicon's the most recent example of a larger scale microfit, but I haven't been. I one of the things I need to do is get down to the Whitby area and take a look at that project. The CEO was actually in Toronto yesterday talking about other things, but my understanding is that right now those are kind of islanded, if you will, parts of the grid. They're not sort of more broadly connected, but there's a lot of technology, like the technology's there. I'm not saying it needs to be invented, but we have in our distribution territory, we have 16 substations. Each one of those substations has connections back to our operations and control center with feeders throughout the city. And right now, the way the system is set up is all of our supply of power comes from the provincial wholesale market. So in a future scenario where each one of those substations potentially has 10, 15, 20 to 1,000 different inputs and outputs into it, the technology needs to be there to both discharge and turn on, like allow and integrate that in. You also need bidirectional metering at the individual level. Right now, we're probably 36 to 48 months out from supply chain to get AMI 2.0 new smart meters. There's a lot of new investment that'll have to happen to the grid to enable and support that kind of stuff. It's great on a pilot level. I would love to see the business case for that project in Alexicon as well, because at the end of the day, you still need to understand what the cost is of that technology to enable that for sure.
So David, I'm cognizant of the time here. There are a couple of questions that kind of maybe you can tackle that get to the ability or the strategic willingness of Utilities Kingston to tackle generation within the city.
Sorry, I'm trying to scroll through the questions. Just on the district energy one, we are actually exploring a partnership with Oakville Enterprises Corp. Again, I would say our main focus is trying to make sure that as a distributor that we have the technology that's going to need to be put into the grid to support all of these changes. In terms of new generation, that's not something that we're really focused on right now. Is it something we're open to? Absolutely, but I really want to emphasize that, like, as a distributor, we can go off in a number of different strategic directions. At the end of the day, all of these different things can happen, but we need to build that new transmission station, and we need to make sure that we understand what's going to be required to do support DERs and bidirectional metering and discharging of the grid at the local level. The project down in Essex is a really, really important example of learning how to do that. They're putting the LDC is putting calls into the market at Tuesday at noon, from 11:30 till noon. We need 10 megawatts of power, and that can be through new supply. It can be discharging of a battery resource, or it can be turning off power. And they need predictive analytics to be able to understand when they need that, what the market price of that is going to be, where the available supply can be. And all of that needs to be done. You know, that's not an individual person making those decisions. That has to all be built into the technology that is used to manage the grid. So I think that's where a lot of our emphasis is right now, in trying to understand that, and how you know, the future bidirectional smart meters are going to fit back into our grid so that we can enable that as well.
It's fantastic. I think, you know, what you've really shown us and shown a light on here, David, is that this is really a complex landscape, and it's changing, and there's probably more questions than answers in the environment out there. But I did want to thank you very much for your presentation. It's super interesting. Obviously, a lot of interest from our membership here. I wish we could go on for 2 hours of Q&A. I bet you we could.
Yeah, I'd love to answer questions. Paul, I'll just answer really quickly. Once Steve put in a comment about order the new transformer. There's an example of where we don't control our own destiny. So it's 5 years to get regulatory approval for the new transmission station, likely 4 to 5 years. We're not allowed to order new transformers, which we know will take 2 to 3 years to deliver until we get regulatory approval and leave to construct. So there's some real challenges at the pace that this is going to happen going forward.
For sure. So thank you very much, David, on behalf of Switch and our attendees and our membership here. That's fantastic. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your knowledge on this subject. It's quite fascinating.
A lot to learn for all of us. Thank you for everyone's interest and attention. I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much. And if you can't stick around, then please do so. If you have to go, then we totally understand.
Great, thanks.
So moving on. Sorry, Darko, did you have something there? No, good. This is the time when we do our sector news. So I'm going to have a general call out in order here, and if anybody has any information or comments they want, then please chime in. Calling out for fuel cell and hydrogen energy issues. Anything there? Please speak up if you have something.
Comment if that's useful.
Please, yes.
Yeah, I think maybe it's just maybe of interest. In the last 2 weeks, the Americans announced a $7 billion investment on their hydrogen hubs across the United States. And I think relevant to Ontario is 2 of the hubs, and there's 7 hubs, each of them got about $1 billion. So there's a little over $2 billion been invested in a hub that's going to be in Pennsylvania, Ohio, just south of the Great Lakes, and another one in the Michigan region. And both of those have the potential to make very low cost hydrogen. And certainly work that we've been doing is looking at, the opportunities for various parts of Canada for zero emission hydrogen to be used mostly as energy carrier for heavy transportation. But also when you actually look at the economics of it, and you look at the issue relative to everything, industrial heating, some space heating, certainly steel making. We've just had a report come out a few months ago on the role of hydrogen in steel making in Hamilton. I think that the possibility to have zero emission hydrogen produced in the United States and pipelined into Canada is significant. With the major pipeline, we've had lots of discussions with Enbridge about a hydrogen pipeline going down the 401 corridor, to support heavy transport trucks and trains. And that opens up some really interesting opportunities for backup power generation in communities like Kingston, but also even for space heating is a much more cost-effective strategy for retrofitting buildings, especially in commercial buildings and also older buildings that we're putting in heat pump is very extremely difficult. So anyhow, I can talk more about that sort of stuff, but I think the announcement in the last 2 weeks of $7 billion investment, we're now in a lot of discussions with the federal government about what can be done in Canada would be sort of a similar sort of approach to looking at essentially hydrogen is and electrification are sort of very compatible with one another because you can convert hydrogen into electricity and electricity into hydrogen. So it's part of a potential part of a net zero design for an energy future.
For sure. Yeah. I noticed too in the news lately the concept of white hydrogen, so geological hydrogen formations has
Certainly.
popped up, and that's really fascinating. If that's actually a real thing with any sort of.
Oh, it's real. It's hard to find though. You know, if you find a little geology with white hydrogen, boy, you've got your you can start printing money.
Sounds like it. Thank you. Moving on to solar, wind power, and energy storage projects. Any news from the crew here? I did notice one of the questions in the chat from, I think it was Bob, was asking about what's the status of virtual net metering in Ontario, and that's something I'm always very interested in as well. And I don't know if anybody has any information other than still being looked at. I see James. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just, I think I heard, I'm trying to remember his name was Lucas. Is it CFB that's doing a pretty big installation along with their own storage? I think he had a presentation last year on it. Anybody got any information on that or an update?
I don't think we have
I'd say
anybody.
no, I'd say no updates, but we can certainly get Lucas back.
Yeah. Sounds like a good idea.
Yeah.
There's the bioenergy field. Any information there? We heard some information from David.
Maybe if you don't mind, just to add to the solar and wind component. But we're not from Kingston, we're from Ottawa, representing the Ottawa Renewable Energy Cooperative. I just wanted to point out, I really noticed that in the presentation I noticed this gap. We talked about sort of solar installations at the residential level, and then sort of the big ISO procurement. The piece that I thought was really missing was the community level solar and wind, and I guess that's really the space where we fit in. So community funded solar installations, wind installations at sort of the municipal level, at the small industrial level, mid-sized industrial level. And yeah, we're just excited to come to Kingston and see what the opportunities are in that regard. And I mean, the issue of the regulatory framework and the lack of virtual net metering has been pointed out previously, and you know we have to deal with the situation as it is. But there are still opportunities even in this existing environment for sort of medium, small scale distributed renewable energy generation. Because I noticed the DER part was really mostly focusing on storage. The way we're looking at it, it should really be about generation.
Super. Thank you for that. I know Spencer's not here, but anybody got any information about electric vehicles and electrification of transportation?
Sorry, I was just would like to tag on to what Marion said, and while recognizing that gap, I think, Marion, we should invite you to give us a presentation sometime in the spring on that level, because that is a very important part, and a part where individual citizens can be part of it.
Absolutely, Darko, and I am excited. I was in contact with Abdul from Invest Kingston,
Yes.
and he invited us for the early February presentation.
Okay,
so,
good.
Yes.
So we'll be in touch on that, and that'll be an opportunity exactly to fill in that. Yeah. Thanks.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Great idea. Thank you, Darko. Yeah, back to electric vehicles and electrification of transportation. Any
See Chad with his hand up.
Thank you, Chad.
Yeah, I came across a story in driving.ca about a $91 million fund that Ontario has put together to put additional charging stations in place. And the list of eligible organizations is just fantastic. Businesses, nonprofits, municipal governments, Indigenous organizations, public sector organizations, and the focus is on 170,000 population and smaller communities, which Kingston fits in. is there someone in the city or some of the various organizations that's aware of this and they're going to subsidize putting in EV stations everywhere, and I think we ought to take advantage of that.
I can jump in on that one. Dan Cornelick here with the facilities department. We actually look after operating and maintaining the city's public EV charging stations. So we do have a pretty large network of EV charging stations at a lot of our public sites, and we are aware of that recent grant that was released. So we're looking at that and the potential at this stage to even upgrade some of our existing level 2s might be on the horizon to level 3s. So we are looking at various strategies. The city of Kingston, through Paul McClatchy, actually did roll out our kind of initial network to encourage early adoption. And we are trying to take a look at, in the context of parking and transportation impacts and everything like that, holistically, what is our strategy going to be going forward with respect to the EV charging network? And especially now that the private industry and private ownership of these things has really started to roll out as well. But I can tell you it's something we're definitely looking at.
Are you encouraging any of the larger industrial companies and Queen's University to also participate in this? Because they're certainly eligible.
So that's great. Typically, our focus is on our public infrastructure that we do have, but certainly we are sharing information with our networks, which do include the other institutional owners in the city as well.
Excellent.
I did post a link to a news story on that, Chad. It's in the chat.
Right.
If anybody here is interested, they can start there and look for some more information, and maybe it'll lead them to a path.
And I also posted the actual solicitation from Ontario.ca.
Perfect.
Thank you. Paul, I've got a little bit more on EVs. It's
Please.
more of a question and maybe a question back to David Fell as far as strategy. I'm seeing a lot of articles recently saying that, EV interest has peaked. EV technology is changing so much, it's going to be replaced by other technologies. Does anybody see any credibility in those projections? And does that potentially impact, what we need as far as, bidirectional control of EV batteries for storage and distribution? I mean, it's a big question, but I've seen a lot of sort of doom and gloom articles about the EV sector the last month. Is it just the news cycle doing its thing? I see Dave Lazell smiling there. Any comments from anybody else?
Can I comment on that for a second?
Sure.
So I was really involved with the microfit and some of the programs that rolled out with your refrigerators being, getting a deal if you bought your refrigerators and so on and so forth because they were more efficient. One of the things that's really happening in a big wave right now is them discouraging of EV. And they're saying if we really cared about the EV industry and so on and so forth, that it would have had bi-directional right off the hop, and our technology is there, but there obviously isn't the interest that there needs to be. And I think that somebody needs to call these people out that are spreading the propaganda like that, because what's happening is people are stressed everywhere, so they'll jump right on that for sure. Just my thought.
Oh, Dave Lazell saying the oil industry is getting worried. And are they behind this?
I just also noticed there's really more and more misinformation out there, so we have to be very careful, I think.
So those of us who are
I was
EV users, those of us who are EV users need to continue to promote the positives.
I agree.
Yeah, I was in Calgary last week, and I was in Calgary last week at conferences, and oh boy, they're getting nervous. So it's a very interesting.
Okay, so it's the social media manipulation again. Anyway,
Well,
sorry, Paul. Back to whatever.
Thanks. We'll have to keep our eyes on that for sure. Next on my list is the geothermal heat pumps in green buildings sector. Anybody got anything to report there? And once, going twice. On to education and conservation programs. Going once, going twice, and then finally, policy and collaborations. We heard a lot about policy today. Okay. Anything I missed in terms of must shares that people want to jump in with?
Just
James?
I'm the community guy, so I'm just going to say there's a lot of untapped, willing and ready community horsepower waiting out there beyond the professional silos, all due respect for professionals here, and beyond the institutions. And they just need to be asked.
Fair comment. Thank you. Okay. Well, we're
I
finishing
think
up.
Bob Vasilis has his hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry, Bob. Go ahead.
No problem, Paul. Just a quick announcement. It's an interesting, there is a collaboration that we've just entered into with a UK firm, Undo Carbon. It's a fairly massive undertaking for enhanced rock weathering. I've dropped a link on their announcement in the chat if you'd like to learn a bit more about it, but it is going to be, you're going to read about this a fair bit in the coming year.
Thanks for that. And it really is a fascinating project. I can attest to that. And if anybody heard this recent stories about carbon capture and injection into undersea basalt formations, I think what Bob's got is a much more efficient way to do it, albeit perhaps on a smaller scale.
Cool.
Okay, I'm gonna close the meeting then, just pretty much right on time at 9:30, which is amazing. I don't know if we've ever hit that number right on the dot before. I want to say our sincere thanks to David Fell for his presentation and to everyone who's attended and participated here today. I also wanted to plant a reminder that the next open meeting date for Switch, I'm not sure if we have it yet, David or Darko, but
I believe it's December 1st.
December 1st, okay. Very good. So mark that in your calendars at least, and that will be confirmed shortly.
Yes, December 1st. We're hoping for in person. Depends on which speaker we end up with.
Right on. All right, then. Well, I want to thank everybody for attending. A really good turnout this morning. It's fantastic to see the interest. It bodes well. And finally, I think we can leave the Zoom meeting open another 10, 15 minutes if people want to chat amongst yourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you.